stop, una señal de stop, y Cynthia va a poder refrasear la frase y yo acompañar con el español, para hacerlo también fluido. So, well, Leticia said we are ready with the transmission. Welcome to our YouTube viewers. We are very happy again to have Cynthia with us, joining for this adventure we are taking in Feminist International Relations at the University of Buenos Aires. Bienvenidos a todos y a todas. Vamos a comenzar en un minuto. Primeramente, Cynthia va a hacer una disertación breve de los tópicos, de unos aproximadamente media hora, y luego vamos a hacer preguntas y respuestas. Cynthia quiere escucharles la voz a ustedes, así que vamos a hacer, yo seré la traductora. Well, I was talking to the rest of the group how we are going to, how the methodology would be. Cynthia will speak first. Maybe we should skip presentations. You all know who Cynthia is. She's the teacher of all of us. We are also teachers here, and the audience have a lot of also university professors that are very well known, are very working hard in different areas of IR. We also have grad students, and we also have people from research groups in Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Uruguay, Brazil. We have lots of partners here. This is a movement that it's forming in Buenos Aires, in the Southern Cone, especially regarding feminist IR. So I talk a lot because I am a little nervous, and I'm very happy for Cynthia to be here. So sorry for that. It's been long since I'm speaking this a lot in English. We all miss our congresses, and we hope we can meet you in ISA next year. We need our hugs, our kisses, our coffee breaks. We need to see each other and to build community, because this is what we're talking about: building community, building IR community with the North, with the South, no matter what, with a common goal that is making life just with more justice, more easy for the people, and with love, especially with love. Well, bueno, vamos a empezar. Welcome, Cynthia, to the University of Buenos Aires. The floor is all yours. You are our teacher. So you can start with the time. You can introduce, while you talk, you can introduce how you get to this point, how you get how did your feminist curiosity came up, and what are the main issues at stake, so on and so on.
Well, I am so pleased that Leticia and Daniela and Emmanuel asked me to come and join you all and be part of this community creating event. And I think that's the best kind of event. And we're all learners. You know, if you stop learning, you're dead. So we're all students all the time. And in many ways, we're all teachers. I always think you're a teacher every time you explain something. Every time somebody says, "What, you're studying that? Why are you studying that?" And then you become the instant teacher to say to your mother or to your best friend, well, I'm studying this because. And so we're all teachers all the time. And it's nice to see some people I know from other settings, Marielle and others. And it's lovely. I should say right from the start, and I think it's really important for all of us to kind of give our autobiographies in this sense. And that is, I certainly wasn't born a feminist. And it's very important for all of us, whenever we begin to ask feminist questions, to think back about what it was like when we didn't ask feminist questions, and why did we start. And I think it's always a good thing to explain to people and to ourselves, because it says you become a feminist in your curiosity, maybe in your activism as well, but at least in your intellectual life, you become a feminist because you begin to see that you learn more, that you make better sense of the world. It's not that studying non-feminist, not anti-feminist, but non-feminist approaches isn't useful. It is useful. But what I keep thinking about, I went to University of California at Berkeley in the 1960s when Berkeley was activist hub. But I didn't ask any feminist questions, and none of my professors asked any feminist questions. And to tell you the truth, none of my friends who are graduate students who are very active in Berkeley politics, none of them asked any feminist questions. What happened to me was that I studied international development, especially in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysia. I studied a country that's very ethnically diverse and whose politics are really shaped by ethnic identities and ethnic loyalties and ethnic organizing. So I was very conscious of ethnic politics, which is a very helpful thing going forward as a feminist. Never, never, never forget your ethnic and racial questions, ever. So I was lucky that way. I wasn't a feminist, but at least I started by asking feminist questions about education, about party politics, about notions of nationalism. So that was very helpful. And then I began studying militaries with my ethnic hat on, if you will. I had friends, this is in the 1980s, I had friends who were 1970s and 80s, who were studying coups d'etats, which you know all about in Argentina and in Brazil and in Chile. You know about coups d'etats. And what I realized that a lot of my friends who were studying coups d'etats and were very smart and very good and tutored me a lot in it, never asked ethnic questions. And I would have coffee with them at the Latin American Studies Association meeting, for instance, or the African Studies Association meetings. I would have coffee with my friends, sometimes something a bit stronger. And I would just, as you do with your friends, you pick their minds. You want to know things, and you want to know things that they know about that you don't. And I said, well, in Uganda, I said, for instance, one of the countries that had a coup d'etat, or in Ghana, what's the ethnic identities of the officers who are leading these overthrows of elected governments? And they would immediately tell me, they all knew which ethnic groups in the military at which level, which rank, were the leaders of the overthrows of the democratic governments, of the coups. They all knew, but they never thought to write about it. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I should look further into this. So this is still my pre-feminist time, I began writing about researching. It took me about 7 years, I think, to research both militaries and police forces. I became very interested in police forces, particularly the most militarized departments of police forces around the world. And I asked, what is the ethnic makeup of the militaries in all these countries, and how does it matter for democracy? How does it matter for militarization? How does it matter for ethnic politics as well, both exclusionary and inclusionary, oppressive and more justice focused? And I wrote a book called Ethnic Soldiers, which I still am very, there's some things, for those of you who are students, there's some papers you've written that you're happiest about, not because it got the best grade, although probably it did, but because you learned so much when you wrote it. I bet everybody has kind of a favorite paper or a favorite article, and later on a favorite book that you've written. And it's your favorite because you remember how excited you were when you learned things researching it. I love the excitement of research. And so I loved this book, Ethnic Soldiers, that spent about 7 years writing, because I learned so much about the workings of racism and ethnocentrism in the workings of militaries over time. That is, over sometimes decades. And when I was finishing the book, I've written about this a little bit because it's so graphic. I can picture myself. I was in Norway. I had a little grant at a Peace Research Institute, and I was doing the index. Nowadays, with my publishers, I tend to contract out the doing of the index, but I always talk to the indexers. Because indexes, look out, I could go off on a little riff on this. Indexes are where you make visible concepts, people, groups, events. And that means it's also where things are made invisible. So when I was doing this, so this is one of the last books that I did my own index. And I learned a lot from doing it. It's a very tedious task, but also a very political task. And all of a sudden, I was beginning to have feminist friends. And so what happened to me, sitting in a little Norwegian cafe, trying to do this indexing work, I thought, oh my God, my British feminist friends are going to pick up this book called Ethnic Soldiers. Now, this is a dream because, of course, none of my friends were ever going to see this book. I mean, you know, you write these things and you hope your friends will ever see it. But anyway, but I had this little fantasy that my feminist friends were going to pick up this book in a bookstore and they were going to go, and I now knew what feminists do. Maybe a lot of you do it. You see a book that, you know, books are expensive. You see a book when you can go back into bookstores after the pandemic, or you look online, but especially in a bookstore because that's when you can look at the index. And I knew my feminist friends, what they did is they'd pick up a book in a bookstore, decide the title looked interesting. And so they thought, well, should I spend my hard-earned money on buying this book? And what they did, and they still do, I still do it. You go immediately to the index to see if there's women under the W's. And then, of course, you also go, and if it's in English, you look under S to see if there's anything about sexuality or sexual harassment. You look under P to see if by some wild chance this author even considered patriarchy, right? You look under M to see even if wilder possibility, they are mentioning misogyny, right? And then you buy the book, of course. But I was just stuck with the W's. And I hadn't mentioned in this 400-page book that I learned so much about ethnicity in militaries, I had not talked about women at all. I couldn't mention a single page where I had mentioned in this 400 pages, I'd written about militaries in, I don't know, 20 countries. And then I found I had mentioned women twice. This is just luck. This is like the muse flies over your head and the muse gives you the inspiration to say women twice in 400 pages. And once was about the South African military, then the apartheid military, and once was about the Gurkhas, who are an ethnic group in Nepal that were hired by the British Imperial Forces. And I did say, so I got my W's in, but that was the beginning. So becoming a feminist meant that I began asking, this is the key about becoming a feminist as a researcher, a writer, a teacher, a student, a citizen, even most important, is you ask new questions. That's the key. It's what do you find worth asking? It's your curiosity that defines you as a feminist. And sometimes you really aren't even sure what you'll find. So for instance, this morning in where is it? In the New York Times, just a minute. Okay, this is confession time. I am addicted to the New York Times. I love the New York Times. And furthermore, I'm so addicted that I only read, I'll read online sometimes, but I read the New York Times in print, right? I'm really addicted. So you all have your favorite papers, the newspaper that is most reliable, has the best journalist group of reporters. Okay, so this is what happens when you have a feminist curiosity and you read things that don't have much of one. If you're reading the print version. See, this is what's so great about reading things in print. You get out your pen and you can start talking back to the authors. In this case, the journalists and their editors. If you have a good newspaper, by the way, a lot of you know this because you know about the politics of journalism, really good reporting, whether it be on television or online reporting sites or radio. I'm a big fan of radio, or in print newspapers and online newspapers. The real key to serious journalism is the interactions between a highly trained, highly ethical, very energetic reporter and his or her editors, who ask questions, make them go back and revise things, do extra interviews. So you always have to ask about the editors. Okay, so, but here's what happens when you have a feminist curiosity and you have a print copy of the newspaper. Ta-da. See what I just did to this article? So this is an article, it's a fascinating article. This is an article about the new protest movements, especially against corruption in Iraq. I don't think most of you have been following Iraq politics probably for the last 5 or 6 years, but here it is, and Iraq politics goes on. Well, all my questions up here is, every time the security forces are talked about, I want to know, how masculinized are they? And are they masculinized? Now, Iraq is a multi-ethnic country, so I want to know what's the ethnicity as well as the gender. But it's also, this is Iraq politics today, it's also about militias that operate on their own and really shape Iraq politics today, armed militias. Well, I don't want to know about, quote, militias. I want to know about militia men. Are the militias virtually all male? I want to know. And if so, how did they get recruited? Do most of their mothers, these would be youngish men in their late teens, 20s, early 30s, do their mothers go along with them? This is very feminist now. Do their mothers go along with them joining the militias because it brings in income to the household? Right? Don't always assume that a mother is a pacifist and the son is a militarist. You know, you all know this from your own family. Families are much more complicated than that. Anyway, that's what happens when you become a feminist. You begin writing all over, if you own them. Only if you own the books, only if you own the newspapers, not if it's a shared newspaper at the cafe. You begin writing all over them because you want to know things. And why? So let me give an example. What began to happen so I was still studying militaries. That's really one of the ways that I get into international relations, is I'm very interested in all kinds of militaries, as well as countries that don't have militaries. Okay, write down or think for yourself. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Which governments and political systems in the world today, you should be able to name at least 3, but maybe you can name more, have decided that they can have a sovereign state political system without having a state military. I'll give you 10 seconds. Go on, say it in the chat. Write in the chat which countries you know whose governments have decided that they can be sovereign states in a international system of states without having a state military.
We have two answers in the chat. We need the third.
The third one will be very hard for most of you to know because you don't probably know much about the politics of the South Pacific Island countries.
Iceland, Costa Rica.
Okay, Iceland,
Costa Rica, and Laura Galeano said Kiribati.
Yes, right, and also Samoa. So there's 4 already. Okay, so when I say I'm interested in the international politics of militaries, it means I'm also interested in the local politics of militaries. And I think one of the things that happens to you when you begin to have a feminist curiosity, you ask the kind of questions that show the interactions between international politics and local politics. It's one of the distinctive qualities of a feminist curiosity. You don't have this hard barrier between international politics and local politics. So for instance, in the Malvinas War, Argentina's war with Britain in the 1980s, what's that, about 1983?
82.
82. As a feminist, you can do historic work. You can go back and ask questions that should have been asked but weren't asked. I want to know about military wives. I always want to know now. I never used to. When I was trained at Berkeley and in the first, decade of my teaching, I guess, it's embarrassing. But I never thought, this is really embarrassing. Don't be insulted, those of you who are sociologists. It just shows how stupid a political scientist can be. That's me being stupid. I thought that if you were interested in these people called wives, I thought you were probably a sociologist. I didn't think that somebody who was a, quote, serious political scientist had any business being interested in marriage or wives or families. That's how stupid I was. But now, and this was starting in the 1980s, now I want to know, in the British-Argentine War in the Malvinas, I want to know, what did the women married to all the soldiers, not just the high-ranking, the lower-ranking as well, soldiers of the Argentine military and of the British military, what did they think? What did those women married to soldiers, what male soldiers, they're almost, at that point, almost all male soldiers, what did they think about what their husbands were doing? And did they ever voice it? And it's interesting if they didn't. It's interesting if they did. Were either the Argentine junta at the time or the British government under Thatcher, who was no feminist, were either of those ministries of defense nervous about the wives during that war? How to keep them silent? How to keep them complicit? How to keep them, quote, supportive of their husbands? If so, what did they do? Because here's one of the big things I now look back on my non-feminist work. I think that asking feminist questions and really pursuing the answers, even if you only can come up with partial answers, by the way, are fine so long as you alert your students or your hearers or your readers that this is a partial answer and here's what we need to know more of. If you only can come up with a partial answer, don't worry in that sense. At least let your listeners and your readers know that you've got at least a hunch of what's going on. And here's what we know from asking feminist questions. We know that both local politics and international politics require the wielding. Wielding is like if you have a sword, you wield it, right? In English. Requires the wielding of more power, public power, than most non-feminists ever imagine. So let me give you an example. Staying even on the Malvinas War of 1982. Well, there's a lot of literature in Spanish and in English about that war. Most of it just referred to the militaries being deployed by governments. Well, to a feminist, that kind of commentary, that's a scholarly commentary, sounds so naive. No government can simply deploy a military. Now we know this because as feminists, we know how much power is wielded by governments to keep wives and girlfriends, don't forget girlfriends and don't forget mothers, wives, girlfriends, and mothers of soldiers quiet. To keep them supportive of just their son or just their husband or just their boyfriend without thinking about foreign policy. This is power used by governments. And we have cases all over the world now that we have evidence from. governments do things behind the scenes that most non-feminist political scientists pay no attention to try and pressure mothers, girlfriends, and especially wives to imagine that they can't think about foreign policy or have any public views about it without damaging their marriage or without damaging their relationship to their son or without endangering their boyfriend's security. That was my first big wake-up call as a feminist. And when you ask, well, what is it that asking feminist questions brings to our study and our understanding of national politics as it interacts with international politics, this is my first big wake-up to me, having been a non-feminist and becoming a feminist. All of a sudden, I realized I had been underestimating power. I had imagined that governments, quote, deployed militaries. Well, that is such a I now realize, such a naive sentence. Because I was not then, back then in those old non-feminist days, I wasn't then sufficiently curious about all the gender politics that were fashioned and used in order to deploy the military, any military, to do anything. So you hear about, for instance, here's another example. Some of you probably been following the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, which have now been going on for 2 years. Very brave people of all ages, and both women and men in Hong Kong. There was one journalist. I'm a big fan of really thoughtful, imaginative. I don't mean imaginative like making things up. Imaginative, like asking questions that none of their colleagues ask. In the middle of the most public of the protests, when the Hong Kong government, at the direction of Beijing, was using police violence to put down the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters, in the middle of that, a reporter decided to ask about the women. They were almost all male police. I look at every photograph. They don't tell you everything, but I always look at the gender of protesters, police, soldiers, officials. I'm always counting. This is all the other thing that happens to you when you become a feminist. You just count everything, right? By gender and race and ethnicity, if you can tell. This reporter thought, this is the imaginative intellect at work, I wonder what these police, Hong Kong police officers, male officers, I wonder what their wives think about them being out there beating up their fellow Hong Kong citizens. Such a great way just to say, I wonder. And you don't know what you're going to find. You just know, I think I better look into it. And what this reporter found, it was a woman reporter, by the way, but it, feminist curiosity can be used fruitfully by men and women and non-binary people too. This reporter went and interviewed Hong Kong women married to Hong Kong police. And you know what she found? She found that a lot of these wives is a little different than being married to a soldier, being married to a police. And this reporter found that these women didn't like it. They didn't like their husbands out there beating up their fellow citizens. They weren't sure what to do about it, but they said, this is bad for our marriage. I didn't become a wife of a Hong Kong police officer to be complicit in anti-democracy. or in violence against my fellow unarmed citizen demonstrators, that's not why what's this about our marriage? Now, given the restrictions on coverage in Hong Kong or any autocracy, it's very hard to follow that up. But I want to know the same thing about Belarus. I want to know the same thing about Myanmar. I want to know the same thing about any country that is sliding into or rushing into autocracy. If the government wields a militarized police force as its first arm of oppression, and that police force is overwhelmingly male, well, first of all, I want to know what the men think they're doing. Not all men join police forces in order to be violent, but I really want to know what their wives and mothers think and how that affects their policing. And will they resign from the police force or just not sign up for a new contract because this isn't good for their marriage? So families, wives, marriage, policing, international affairs, militarism, waging war. I don't think we really understand what any war, large or small, long-term or short-term, is unless you explore with a feminist curiosity, which means you are serious about women's ideas. To have a feminist curiosity means you have to take women seriously. Not because you think they're all saints, not because you even think they're all admirable. I'm very interested in Margaret Thatcher. She wasn't just non-feminist, she was anti-feminist. But she got to that point by trying to be part of the boys' political party elite club, right? So I'm interested in that. To take women seriously means you have to be interested in all their diversity. No woman is just a woman. Is she indigenous? Is she of a new immigrant group? Is she of the elite? Is she a domestic worker? No woman is just a woman. You have to be what they call in English intersectional, which just means realistic. Nobody, no man, no boy, no girl, no woman is just their gender. It interacts with everything else. You have to be a feminist means to take them seriously, not because you immediately admire them. You may come to admire them, but because you will find out things about how politics actually works that you'd otherwise miss. I know in international relations, capital I, capital R, the academic field, there is a whole area of, or a whole theoretical approach called realism. Well, take away the capitals, take away the capital on realism. I think that having a feminist curiosity about national, local, and international politics as they all intersect, I think it makes you more grounded. Some people might say more realistic. Small r, never capital, meaning it's messier, it's more complicated, it's more dynamic than non-feminists imagine. In that sense, this sounds a little insulting and probably a little arrogant, but I'm looking back at myself, at my pre-feminist self. When I look back at and I was doing a lot of really complicated research, I thought. I didn't feel as though I was naive at all. But I look back at myself before I was a feminist, and I think I was naive, I was unrealistic, and I was simplistic. So when you start asking feminist questions, and there are all kinds of things. If during the question and answer time you want some suggestions about your honors thesis or your master's thesis or your PhD or your next book or your next article, just ask me. I'm so greedy. I want you all to do things that I can read. Ask me about topics. But ask the questions and don't worry that you're not sure what the answers will be. you will make us smarter by asking feminist questions. I guarantee it.
Well,
that's my guarantee.
Thank you, Cynthia. We've been over half an hour and we have the first question. Alessandra, would you like to make it out loud? You wrote it in the chat, but the floor is yours to put the mic on and introduce yourself and ask the question to Cynthia. And thank you, Cynthia, so much. We were very keen. And it was very clear your English, so nothing to be included. Alessandra.
Thank you, Daniela. Cynthia, it's such a pleasure to hear you in concert.
That's
Thank
nice.
you very much. We are very grateful. I am a diplomat. I am posted in London right now. And I am a rare specimen because I am a feminist diplomat, but there are a lot of us in Argentina. Many of us are here in the Zoom, so we are very happy to hear you.
How exciting.
I wanted to ask you about the concept of power, because when you said that you realized that you have underestimated power, in which type of power were you thinking of? Because you know that we learned about power when we study international relations, and we measure power in certain terms. But I imagine that you are thinking of other things. So that's my...
there you are in London, practicing feminist diplomacy. How way exciting. Yeah, no, really, very. Yes, I mean, your guess, you were making a guess, and it was a really good guess, which is my notions of power are much broader than what are usually taught. In many ways, I'm interested in any kinds of uses of pressure, uses of intimidation, uses of silencing, uses of persuasion, uses of influence, all of those things. So I use a shorthand. It probably is a bad shorthand, Alessandra, because it evokes that kind of simplistic notion of power, like sending in the battleship kind of power. I really mean any efforts to try and make other people do what the diplomat, the general, the political party leader wants the other person or the other government to do. So yes, all those forms of power. And you know what, Alessandra, I've in the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time looking at the workings of sexual harassment, and actually looking at the anti-sexual harassment, you know, the hashtag Me Too movement. I've watched that as international politics. So I'm very interested in all the kinds of subtle, sometimes not so subtle power used within an organization to keep women silent about the abusive behavior of some of their male colleagues. And that to me is a study of power. And it's oftentimes power as humiliation, you know, power as enticement, power as false promises. Yes, so you're absolutely right about that. Yeah, and I think you and your feminist diplomatic colleagues know that feminists really, what's one of the great gifts of having a more feminist curiosity and more feminist understanding of power is that you see the multitude of forms it takes. And I think the hashtag Me Too movement, the anti-sexual harassment movement, and all the women who've had the courage in so many different kinds of organizations to speak out, I think they're showing us the varieties that power takes. They've really educated me. That is, women in the South Korean television industry, women working in the Ford automobile factories, women working in diplomatic corps, women working in humanitarian aid, which oftentimes suffer a lot of abuse, sexual abuse, and women working in peacekeeping. Is the Argentinian military now are they deploying for UN peacekeeping operations? Is that one of the things the Argentinian military now does?
Yes, it's one of the things they do. Yes.
Well, that's a good question to ask. It's very hard to get answers, isn't it? It's very hard to get answers. The UN senior establishment doesn't want to hear about it. The country donating ministries of defense don't want to hear about it. What they do is they just ship the abusive male military peacekeeper home and leave the woman who's been abused in the conflict zone to handle it by herself.
Yes.
There's a very good site, you probably know about this, for the rest of you. There's a very good site called Code Blue. Blue is in the United Nations. Code Blue, and it's a very small but very, very powerful critical site, very up on UN operations, and it's an offshoot of a project, an NGO project called AIDS Free, AIDS as in the disease, AIDS Free World, and then Code Blue. And it has been tracking the sexual abuse of male peacekeeping soldiers on local women. So I'd be very interested to hear whether the Argentine military has had any of those experiences and whether they've been honest and public about them.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Alessandra. And now I will give the mic to Florencia Bobadilla. She will speak in Spanish and I will do the translation. Flor, if you want to make your question.
Excellent.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Cynthia. Realmente es una gran alegría conocerte. Voy a hacer la pregunta en español porque mi inglés es muy, muy malo.
Let me show you. She's very happy to meet you, Cynthia. She's very honored and welcome, and she will speak in Spanish.
Oh, that's great.
Quería consultarte, bueno, estoy realizando mi trabajo de investigación y es en relación al régimen internacional de derechos humanos de las mujeres y la interacción de la política exterior argentina entre 1975 y 1995. Quería consultarte qué aspectos de la política exterior argentina te parece que debería resaltar en este intento de configurar una interacción, si es que la hubo.
Okay, I will try to make that in English. Well, Florencia is doing her research, his grade dissertation. She's still a student, right? Florencia, where are you from? ¿De dónde estudias? Student, where? ¿Dónde?
Estudié en la Universidad de Tandil, la licenciatura en Relaciones Internacionales.
She studied in the National University of Tandil, which is a university in the center of the Buenos Aires province, of the Buenos Aires
Okay, great.
Tandil. A very nice place to go. Well, she's doing her research in the intersection between the human rights international regime and Argentinian foreign policy from 1975 to 1995. I would say she would like to know which aspects do you think she should highlight or point out regarding Argentinian foreign policies in the sense of having a feminist curiosity, a feminist question. What I would like to add to Florencia's question is that the time the period she chose is 1975, is the government before the coup d'etat, the last coup of etat in Argentina, and 1995 is after when democracy is back. So you have there 20 years of mixing dictatorships and democratic governments. And I would like to also mention, I don't know if I'm sure you're aware of, but that also rang my bell while you were talking about Malvinas War, is that our human rights movement, especially the one regarding the end of the dictatorship, was conducted by women. We have madres de Plaza de Mayo and grandmothers. The mothers and the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo is the square where we all go to make to protest.
Yeah.
It's in front of our pink house. We don't have a white house. We have a pink house.
Yes.
So she wants to know which aspect would you highlight regarding international human rights regime and Argentinian foreign policy?
Yeah, two things, Francia. The first thing is I love that you have picked very specific dates. And I would urge this for everybody, no matter what you do, and including if you're doing something currently, that is, you're investigating something that's current. Give your reader, this is all for your reader, give your reader dates and explain the dates, because the dates are not just dates. Dates are, and Florencia and Daniela help me understand, dates are the complicated political context. I always urge any researcher, whether you be a student or a full professor, give us dates so we know what is the specific political context. Context is always complicated. Context in the country that you're studying, or in the international organization you're studying, or in, as you say, the human rights regime world you're studying. Give us dates, because that is a shorthand. You can then tell your readers why you picked those dates. It's a shorthand for the political context that you're exploring, which I think is really useful. Yes, I was very lucky. I met Renee Applebaum, one of the madres. My friend Rita Arditi, who has written one of the best books based on interviews and observations of the madres and also of the grandmothers, called Searching for Life in English. Searching for Life, University of California Press, Arditi, Arditti. And I use that for class. It's in English, and I use it for classes all the time. I think it's been translated, I would hope, in Spanish, because Rita herself is Argentinian. And one of the things that is so striking is in the early days of organizing the madres for their marches, a couple of things that I remember Renee Applebaum sitting in Boston with all of us who wanted to know more while it was going on. Two things she said was that most of us became involved out of our sense of being mothers. It was a sense of motherhood that propelled us into very risk-taking politics. And for a lot of feminists, there's feminists who are activists especially, there's a lot of worry, nervousness about women being imagined as mainly mothers, because that feels like a shrinkage of all the things a woman can be, even if she has children. But in reality, again, small r, in reality, when you look at any women's movement, oftentimes you have to ask when, many you have to ask which ones, women, at least initially, become involved in something as abstract as human rights. That's very abstract, human rights. They become actually personally engaged because they feel so personally motivated by their notion of what is required of them to be good mothers. They may change, and that's really what's so interesting about you, for instance, following over time. Once they become involved in something that becomes a collective political action over time, their motherhood may, in fact, be overtaken by their sense of being citizens. But that may not be at first, and you have to watch it over time. This is also true of Greenham Common, the most famous anti-nuclear women's encampment in Britain, not far from where Alessandra is in London. It's about an hour and a half bus ride down from London, called Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. And most of the women there, who were women from Wales to start with, they walked to this American nuclear weapons site out of their sense of being mothers. And they thought that nuclear war, the threat of nuclear war, should be opposed by people in their motherhood. So I guess a couple of things to ask is, in the human rights regime, which is again very abstract, is there any allowance for these multiple identities of a person who is human, right? Or is it is it written, because the human rights regime mainly was, now we're talking about international law, international conventions, international treaties. When you talk about a regime, not talking about a government, you're talking about a system of international agreements, legal agreements. Most of those were written by non-feminist men who thought in terms of abstractions. I mean, human can feel very abstract as versus a neighbor, as versus a fellow citizen, as versus a family member, as versus a teacher, as versus somebody, a priest or parishioner. Human sounds quite, because it's so universal. And so one of the people who really educated me is a Chilean feminist who died just a year and a half ago, much to my sadness, because she was a great teacher of mine. Teacher meaning friend who taught me things. And many who probably know her, especially if you come from Chile, is Jimena, with an X, of course, Jimena Bunster, Bunster. And Jimena was very active in the anti-military junta, anti-Pinochet movement in Chile. And I can't remember her co-author's name, but Jimena Bunster and her co-author wrote a book about feminist human rights because she wanted to challenge this very kind of masculinized, in a very particular kind of form. Everyone who's male is not masculinized in the same way, right? No cartoons here, no stereotypes. But what she was arguing is that the human rights regime, Florencia, the human rights regime at least had its origins in this very masculinized notion of law and rights. And what Jimena Bunster and her co-author, they asked me to do a little part of it, that's why, but it's in Spanish, I'm sure it is. Yes, I think it's only in Spanish, maybe. They wanted to say, you have to be able to think about human rights more effectively with a feminist curiosity. So you might take a look at that because it was written right in the middle of the time period when you're looking, and it's a critique of what they thought was too legalistic, too abstract, and too, in that sense, masculinized or patriarchal way of thinking about human rights that didn't really mobilize people, didn't get people so engaged. What is an alternative is what are called the human rights defenders movement. I don't know if there are any human rights defenders in Argentina, but they exist in many, many countries, especially in Southeast Asia, also throughout Africa. They are women local activists teaching women and men, girls and boys, about what does it mean to have rights. And in many ways, that is a response to this particular period you're looking at that was just changing the notion of human rights so they could feel more grounded, could feel more part of personal life, and therefore could feel more motivating for civic action. Less a matter of abstract law and more understanding of being human in a community of humans. So you might take a look at both that and see whether some of those critiques ring true to you. And take a look at the madres and take a look at the women that supported the madres. And some Argentinian feminists didn't. They were very nervous about the maternalism of the madres. It felt just too limiting. But that's a good kind of that tension within human rights actual efforts in the middle of this 20-year period you're looking at might be quite enlightening. I don't know what you'll find, but that's the good news.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Cynthia. We have 3 more hands up, and we will see if we can make up to the questions, but they know we have to cut in 15 minutes time. So,
okay.
Diana Calistasha, would you like to post the question yourself, Diana? You wrote it on the chat. Yeah, Diana.
Hello. First of all, it's a pleasure to have the chance to listen to Cynthia. I'm from the province of Salta in the north of Argentina. And I'm also writing my thesis about feminism, more how the international organizations have been working with the movement here in Latin America. And my question is to know how Cynthia think the organization have been working with the movement, or if they have made any change in the way they work, regardless to how strong the image of the woman are nowadays. More thinking that those organizations are kind of dominated for a male figure.
Diana, that's great. It's a great question. Here's, for doing a study, I've always found, both for your sanity, you know, but also so your readers can really digest what you find, pick either just one UN organization or maybe two, rather than saying the United Nations. So maybe, I mean, you have to decide which one. You can say the WHO and UNICEF, or you can, you know, pick two UN organizations. FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, for instance, probably works a lot in Latin America. So pick two. You can even pick one, right? Organizations, and watch how they imagine who it is they're working with. For instance, one of the critiques of UNICEF, but from within UNICEF, because all these organizations now have feminists inside them. That's the good news. But oftentimes it's very hard. Alessandra, as a diplomat, will know this. It's very hard to change organizations from the inside, but it's the outside pressure and the inside dynamic that oftentimes change an organization. Well, a lot of these organizations, Diana, for instance, if they are the FAO, it's very possible, I actually don't know, so that's the good news. It's very possible that they think farmers are men. You all see how bad that is? In fact, I remember when friends of mine were pressuring the World Bank, both from outside and inside. And you know what they were just trying to get the World Bank to do? To stop using the phrase in World Bank economic assessments of development. They would use the phrase, this is their male economists not thinking, they would use the phrase farmers and their wives. And they saw nothing wrong with that. Well, here's a question for your research. I mean, if you take something like the FAO, do they imagine in their practice that farmers are the farmers? That's about credit. It's about training. It's about land title. It's about marketing experience. It's about introducing new crops. For instance, broccoli is a big new crop in Central America. So pick, I would say, two UN agencies, not the UN. The UN has so many parts. And pick one. Sometimes picking one can be really, really useful, especially if by the time you're finished, you have lessons for other people looking at other UN agencies operating in Latin America. So you can end up with lessons for everybody, even though you've gone for depth with the organization, UN organization you've decided to focus on. And see who they think they're working on, for, with. And the second thing is actually watch them in practice. Who do they think is an expert? What's the gender? This is inside, and they'll all have the data. The UN now has to have data on everything. That's a feminist success story. Where are women in the organization you've chosen to look at? Whether it be UNICEF or FAO or whatever organization. Where are women in that organization? Are they all from the bottom to the middle, but they're not at the policy levels, which means you have to learn UN ranking systems. I think P5 is senior, don't trust me, right? But you have to, if you do any organization, for all of you, you do any organization, make sure you learn enough to know who has, coming back to power, who has real influence in the organization, which kinds of officers, and you're going to have to get inside the guts of that organization to know. So that would be my suggestion, is take one organization, not 6, go for depth, look inside the organization, as well as how they're actually carrying out their programs in Latin America. And if you want to, even pick just one UN organization in 2 Latin American countries. I'm all for depth, to tell you the truth, rather than everything. First of all, you're going to write more than 1 book. You're going to write at least 2 books, maybe 6 books. And then you can start looking at others. But go for depth. I would suggest this for everybody. Go for depth with an awareness of the big picture, but go for depth so that you can go for specificity and subtlety and detail. And if you're lucky, even some interviews.
Thank you,
really
Cynthia.
Interested to hear what you find.
Thank you, Cynthia. And now I pass the mic to Florencia Salgueiro. Florencia, would you like to pose your question?
Hello, my name is Florencia. I am from Uruguay, from Montevideo.
Oh yeah, hi.
From la UDELAR, Universidad de la República. And I wanted to ask you, in your years of feminist research, do you think the international situation of women in terms of power has fundamentally changed? Or is it more of a difference between, is there a difference between speech and actions? Because, for example, you made a reference to Me Too, that is like in terms of speech, but in terms of power, has it fundamentally changed the situation?
This is great. And of course, your trick word here, you know this, your trick word that you put in there was fundamentally, wasn't it? Yeah, right. Well, I think it's very interesting. I think that on the superficial level, what's interesting is that a lot of people, women and men, who never have asked a feminist question in their life, who've never been part of any feminist group, have to at least clean up their language. That's no small thing, right? And they don't necessarily clean up their behavior, but they at least clean up their language. And a lot of organizations now, sometimes even down to political parties, they're amongst the hardest to change, by the way. They actually have rewritten their practices. For instance, their hiring practices for a lot of organizations now in international politics, their hiring practices have to be more transparent so that you can see where sexism and racism is affecting hiring. Well, that's new. Transparency rules are always worth fighting for, because at least it means those of us who are watching and are measuring and trying to figure out whether anything's changing, we can see if there's some transparency and data collection. There's a lot more, but not enough, data collection. And for any of you who work internationally, whatever field you're looking at, you want to insist that there is, this is the term used in English, gender disaggregated data. So for instance, you don't want studies of nutrition to be done by household. That's the way, and here's what was measured. How many calories per day did a household consume? Well, that's terrible, because what it hides is what's going on inside the household. That is, are the men, the older boys, and the father of the household, are they consuming a lot more than the women and girls of the household. So you want gender disaggregated data so you can measure, Florencia, so you can measure whether there's change. But you can only measure it if you have data. And you can only use data to measure fundamental change as versus superficial change if the data is gender disaggregated. But the other thing that we've all gotten better at this. Well, look at all of you. You're all doing this. I mean, I'm not kidding. This is big. A lot of you, the equivalents of a lot of you existed in your mother's generation. Don't ever underestimate how many feminists there have been in Latin America since the 1890s or before, right? But look at all of you, and you're all curious, and you're all doing investigations, and you're all going to write things that are going to make us smarter. That is progress, right? But when we do our investigations, we have to look not only at what treaties are passed or new national laws are passed, but we have to study their implementation over time. So I'll give you a good one for Latin America, for those of you who are desperately in search of a research project. See, I am greedy. In 2013, a historic international treaty was passed by the UN General Assembly called, in English, the Arms Trade Treaty. That's the ATT in English. Obviously, it'll be different in Spanish. The Arms Trade Treaty. Well, here's two things about it. It's the first international treaty that tries to regulate small arms, not just jet fighters, not just atomic bombs, not just tanks, but small arms, which of course in daily life do the most damage. This is now particularly guns. That's the first ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, is the first to pass that. Feminists, and you could study this, feminists internationally, I know Brazilian feminists were very important in this lobbying. I know feminists in the sub-Saharan African country of Mali were very important in this. I believe also in the Philippines. It was a transnational feminist lobbying effort to try and get into this treaty. So this is about trying to change things at more than a superficial level, but you still have to investigate. What they got in was Article 7. So you have to have a lot of, stamina to be able to read treaties, not just the news flash. And Article 7, my feminist friends that lobby the UN tell me, Article 7, for the first time ever, says that any government that ratifies the Arms Trade Treaty, it's now up to at least 50 governments that have ratified it. Any government that ratifies the Arms Trade Treaty has to abide by Article 7, which says any country that exports guns has to at least investigate whether the country that's going to buy the guns is likely to have those purchased guns used for violence against women. What the phrase in the treaty is gender-based violence. Who's ever heard of such a thing? That a gun exporting country would have to investigate whether a gun importing country would allow those guns to be used in gender-based violence. And that's historic. And it took a ton of cross-national feminist lobbying to get that into that treaty. Now, here's the question though. Okay, so that's big. It's not just superficial, but here's the question. Has the Argentinian government ratified the ATT? Has the Brazilian government? Has the Uruguayan government? Has the Chilean government? Has the Mexican government? Has the Peruvian government? Have any of them ratified the ATT? Find out which governments have refused to ratify it. That's interesting. Did any of the governments that refused to ratify it You know, negative outcomes are always worth investigating. Did any of the governments that refused to ratify it bring up Article 7? Or was that just minor in their resistance? Of those governments that have ratified it, and I don't know which Latin American governments, you can imagine the US government has not ratified it. You know, forget that. But of the governments, there are 50 governments that have ratified it. Is Article 7 being implemented in practice? How do you implement a requirement that your government that is exporting guns, because it has a gun manufacturing industry locally, like the Belgian government, the Brazilian government, they all have arms industries, small arms industry. Are any of them even trying to assess whether the purchasers of their locally produced guns will have those guns involved in domestic and other forms of violence against women, gender-based violence, which includes LGBT violence as well? So that's the way I think one goes about looking at it, Florencia. I think there is progress, but I'm not sanguine. I'm not, you know, sugary about the progress. I think a lot of men who care nothing about feminist goals now know how to talk the talk. They can say women and men and just instead of just men. They can say he or she instead of just he, you know. But do they change their practice? I don't know. But practices are changed because of all of us doing the kind of research that makes visible what sexism and racism acting together look like. Research is very important. That doesn't mean you're politically biased in your research. It just means you know the kind of questions you're asking should have civic consequences. People should know. We have one more question. I know we're running short on time.
No, we are running. No, we have already finished this. The rest of the. We said we will invite you next year or maybe soon.
You'll have even more questions.
We will have more questions, more and more and more, and maybe more research that
that'd be even better.
Translate to English so we can provide it to you. Well, Cynthia, we are very, very happy. We are honored to have you here, and we are very happy that you were very keen to discuss these issues with us. I think that there is a movement that is going on regarding feminist IR, and you are a part of that. So thank you so much. For the rest of the room, thank you for being here. You know, you have exams and classes, and most of you are working, especially the ones. Well, thank you, Alessandra, and the people outside Argentina. Even though this new Zoom live will gather together every day. So thank you so much. And we'll be very happy, Cynthia, if you ever need anything from us, we will be very happy to help you as well and your community there. So
that's great.
Thank you so
It's
much.
been a real pleasure, and you all give me hope. So make me smarter.
Yes, thank you so much. There is always hope. Well,